Let's set a scene. Imagine you're a kid living in a quiet village in the 15th century Balkans. One day, a group of officials on horseback rolls into town. They're not here for plunder. They're here for produce. And today, you are the produce. They check your teeth, your height, your build. Then they make their selection. In front of your weeping mother and your powerless father, you are taken away. You have just become the personal property of the Sultan. This wasn't a random kidnapping. This was a system. It was called the Devshirme, the collection, or as it was known by those who endured it, the blood tax, which leads us to the central mind-bending paradox of our story. How did one of history's most brutal systems of child enslavement also become one of its most bizarre and effective paths to unimaginable power? But before we get into that twisted reality, let us know in the comments. Now, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it for you? We're always curious to see how far these dark stories travel. The truth of this system is far more complex than the shocking headlines and angry internet comments would have you believe. We'll follow the harrowing journey of these boys from stolen children to the most elite soldiers on Earth. And then we'll enter the chamber to dismantle the toxic myths and uncover how this system actually worked beyond the modern-day propaganda. It turns out the fastest way to the top of the empire was to have your identity, your family, and your freedom erased at the bottom. Welcome to Cursed Chambers, where we don't just explore history, we strip away the lies that surround it. All right. So in the intro, we established the central twisted paradox of the Devshirme system. The idea that a system of child enslavement could also be a high-speed elevator to the top of an empire. It's a concept that feels deeply fundamentally wrong, and it raises the most important question for any historian, which is, why would a powerful, expanding empire resort to such a strange and brutal method for building its army and its government? Why steal children when you have a population of your own to recruit from? To answer that, we need to zoom out. We need to understand the political dumpster fire that was the early Ottoman Empire. Because the Devshirme system wasn't born out of random cruelty. It was born out of a very specific, very dangerous problem. A problem of trust? Let's talk about the Ottoman Sultan in the 14th and 15th centuries. We have this image of him as an all-powerful, godlike figure, and eventually, he would become that. But in the early days, his power was far from absolute. The Ottoman state didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was built through conquest, and the Sultan didn't do it alone. He did it with the help of powerful, freeborn Turkish noble families. These were the great tribal lords, the Beys, who had ridden with the early sultans, who had brought their own armies to the fight, and who had carved out huge chunks of territory for themselves in the process. And therein lies the problem. These noble families were the original shareholders in the Ottoman enterprise. They were proud, they were powerful, and they had massive egos. They saw the Sultan less as an absolute divine king and more as the chairman of the board. The first among equals, a chairman who they had helped put in power and a chairman who they could, if they felt like it, vote out, usually with swords. These families had their own power bases in Anatolia, they had their own armies, and they had their own ambitions. Their loyalty to the Sultan was conditional. It lasted only as long as he was powerful and successful. The moment he showed weakness, they would start to circle like sharks plotting to put their own family on the throne. This is the classic CEO problem after a hostile takeover. You're in charge of this massive new corporation, but your entire senior management team is made up of bitter executives from the company you just bought out. You can't trust them. They resent you. They have their own loyalties. They'll undermine you at every turn. So what do? You can't fire them all at once. You need them to run the company. No, you need a new strategy. You need to create a new class of managers. A new executive team raised from scratch, a team that owes everything to you and nothing to the old guard. And the solution the Ottomans came up with was, well, it was either a stroke of cold-blooded political genius or an act of monstrous evil, or more likely both at the same time. The logic was as simple as it was brutal. If you cannot trust the freeborn nobles of your own people, then you must create a new elite that is not free. Don't recruit your most important soldiers and your most powerful government ministers from the ambitious Turkish families. Recruit them from the people you just conquered. Go to the Christian villages in the newly conquered Balkans, in Greece, in Serbia, in Albania, and take their sons. Not as slaves to work in the fields or quarries. No, that's thinking too small. Take their brightest, their strongest, their most promising young boys to become the new elite, to become the heart of the army and the brain of the government. From the Sultan's point of view, the advantages were immense and obvious. First, these boys had no family ties within the empire. A boy taken from his village in Serbia at age 10 has no powerful uncles in Anatolia, no ambitious cousins plotting at court. His only father, his only patron, is the Sultan himself. Second, he has no regional power base. He has no ancestral lands to retreat to if a plot goes wrong. He has no local army of retainers to call upon. His only home is the palace in Istanbul. His only world is the Ottoman state. And third, and most importantly, he is totally dependent. His entire identity, his education, his new religion, his language, his career, his wealth, his very life, all of it is a gift from the Sultan. The loyalty created by this kind of total dependence is something a free man with his own family and his own ambitions could never truly offer. And this is where we have to get into the weeds for a minute, because the English word slave doesn't even begin to cover what these boys were. In the Ottoman system, they were called kul. The plural is kuller. And being a kul was one of the strangest and most paradoxical social statuses in all of history. On the one hand, yes, you were property. You were not a free man. The Sultan literally owned you in the same way he owned the horses in his stables or the jewels in his treasury. He could promote you to the highest office in the land, or he could have you strangled with a silk cord on a whim, and no one could question his right to do so. But on the other hand, because you were the Sultan's personal property, you were paradoxically elevated above almost everyone else in the empire. You were a member of the Sultan's extended household, which put you in a position of immense privilege. You were immune to the normal laws and courts that governed the free subjects of the empire. Your only judge was the Sultan himself. Let me try an analogy. Imagine you're the CEO's favorite dog. Yes, you're a pet. The CEO owns you. But you get to eat steak for dinner, you sleep on the most expensive furniture, and every single employee in the corporation is terrified of upsetting you because they know who your owner is. Now imagine that dog could also be appointed chief financial officer. That's kind of what it was like to be a kul, so we can finally see our key players clearly. We have the Sultan at the top, the absolute center of power, but deeply paranoid about the people around him. We have the old money, the freeborn Turkish nobility, resentful and ambitious, watching their own power slowly get chipped away. We have the conquered Christian populations of the Balkans, who are about to become an unwilling human resource pool for the empire. And finally, we have our protagonist, the Devshirme boy, the kul, the slave, who has a chance to become a master. The stage is now set for one of the most bizarre and brutal social experiments in human history. But what was it actually like for the boy at the center of this? What did that journey from a Christian village in the mountains to the glittering, deadly heart of a Muslim empire actually look like? That journey of transformation, of being broken down and completely rebuilt. That is the story we will tell next. So in the last part, we established the why of the Devshirme system. We talked about the Sultan's paranoid but politically logical need for a completely loyal ruling class, a class of slave executives who owed everything to him and nothing to anyone else. It's a fascinating, if chilling, piece of political theory. But what was it actually like on the ground? What did it feel like to be the raw material for this grand imperial project? Theory is one thing, human experience is another entirely. To understand that, we have to leave the palace and go to the villages. We have to follow the journey. So for this part, we're going to trace the path of a hypothetical boy, let's call him Marco, from a small Christian village in the Balkans. His story is the story of tens of thousands, a journey of total transformation that unfolded in three distinct, life-shattering acts: the collection, the forging, and finally, the path. Act 1, the collection. For 10-year-old Marco, it starts not with a bang, but with a quiet, creeping terror. It starts with the sight of a government official's banner on the horizon, accompanied by a small contingent of soldiers. A hush falls over his village. Doors are barred. Mothers pull their children close. But there is no hiding. This isn't a raid for plunder or a random act of violence. This is official state business. The arrival of the Devshirme Asa, the collection officer, has been announced. The empire has come to collect its tax. This is not just a random grab-and-go operation. It is a highly selective, deeply methodical recruitment drive. A human audit. The boys of the village, typically between the ages of 8 and 18, are gathered in the center square. The official with a practiced eye begins his inspection. This is a deeply humiliating process. He checks their teeth. He checks their posture, their height, their build. He asks them questions to gauge their intelligence. They are looking for the best, the cream of the crop. They were not just taking bodies, they were taking potential. There were rules, of course. The Ottoman bureaucracy loved rules. They typically wouldn't take an only son because it would extinguish a family line. They wouldn't take orphans because they lacked a stable upbringing. They wouldn't take boys who were already married, or boys who had learned a trade, or boys who were too short, or bizarrely boys who were too handsome, for fear they would become, well, you know, distracted by the temptations of the palace. They were looking for a very specific type of raw material, strong, intelligent, and unblemished. And Marco, unfortunately for him, ticks all the boxes. To the Ottoman state, this was a tax plain and simple, no different from a tax on grain or sheep, only this was a blood tax. To Marco's parents, it was a kidnapping sanctioned by the state. It was the end of their world. There might be tears, there might be desperate pleas, but there is no resistance. To resist is to rebel against the Sultan himself, an act that would bring utter ruin upon the entire village. And then the moment comes. Marco's name is written in a register. A price, though no money changes hands, has been paid. He is pulled from his mother's arms. He takes one last fleeting look at his family, his friends, his village, the only world he has ever known. And then he is marched away, one boy in a sad, bewildered caravan of children, their childhoods officially over. The heartbreak of this separation is hard to imagine. If you feel for these families and the fate of these children, hit the like button to let us know you're with us on this journey. Act 2, The Forging. The long march to the heart of the empire begins. This journey, often hundreds of miles on foot, was the first step in a long process of psychological deconstruction. With every step away from his home, Marco's old identity begins to fray. The language he speaks the world, he knows it all starts to fade into a distant memory. He is now unmoored, a boy without a past, heading towards an unknown future. Marco's first major stop on this journey of transformation is a profound and irreversible one. He, along with the other boys in his group, is formally converted to Islam. His Christian name is stripped from him. He is no longer Marco. He is now given a new Muslim name. Let's say he is now Murad. And to seal this new identity, to mark his entry into this new world, physically and spiritually, he undergoes the painful ritual of circumcision. Any link to his past, his faith, his family, is being systematically, ritually severed. He is being wiped clean. From here, the boys are sorted. Not all of them go straight to the top. The majority, in fact, are first sent to live with Turkish families in the rural parts of Anatolia for several years. You can think of it as a brutal state-sponsored foreign exchange program. Murad is sent to live with a Turkish farming family. Here he learns the basics of his new life. He learns to speak fluent Turkish, not the formal language of the court, but the everyday language of the people. He learns the customs of his new faith in a practical daily setting, and he learns the value of hard labor. It is a process of cultural immersion by total submersion. It's designed to toughen him up and completely erase his Balkan roots. After a few years of this, the boys are recalled and reevaluated. And now, the true sorting begins. The best of the best, the most intelligent, the most promising of the group, are chosen for the ultimate prize. They are brought to the capital, to Istanbul, and inducted into the Topkapi Palace School, the Enderun. The Enderun School was, without exaggeration, the most elite and most brutal boarding school on the face of the earth. Think of it as a mix between Harvard West Point and a maximum security prison all rolled into one. Here inside the palace walls, Murad's real forging would begin. The curriculum was insane. On top of intense physical training, learning archery, wrestling, and horsemanship, he was subjected to a rigorous academic schedule that would make a modern Ivy League student weep. Murad would learn Arabic and Persian, the languages of high culture and diplomacy. He would study mathematics, theology, Islamic law, history, poetry, music, and calligraphy. He was being groomed not just to be a soldier, but to be a sophisticated gentleman, a scholar, a poet, a governor, a potential prime minister. He was being given a classical education that the son of the richest free noble in the empire could only dream of. The goal was to create a new man, a man whose mind and body were perfectly honed instruments of the state. Act 3. The path. After years, sometimes more than a decade of this intense, relentless training, Murad graduates. This isn't a graduation with a cap and a gown. This is a graduation into a life of absolute service and immense potential danger. Depending on his specific talents honed over years of observation by his teachers, he will be set upon one of two main paths. For the boys like Murad, who excelled in strength and discipline, in sheer physical presence and martial skill, the path led to the Janissaries. The Janissary, the new soldiers, these were the elite shock troops of the empire. They were the Sultan's personal infantry, the first full-time professional standing army in Europe since the Roman Empire. They were a formidable brotherhood of warriors, instantly recognizable by their unique uniforms and famous white hats. They were in their prime, the most disciplined and terrifying fighting force in the world. They were technically celibate. They lived in barracks, and their only family was their corps, their only father, the Sultan. They were the sharpened tip of the Ottoman spear. But for the intellectually brilliant, for the ones who had truly mastered languages, law, and strategy in the Enderun school, a different and arguably more powerful path awaited. The path of the Is-Olan, the inner pages. They would serve within the palace itself, working their way up the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the imperial government. They were the future administrators of the empire. They could become provincial governors, admirals of the fleet, members of the imperial council, the Divan. And for the most talented, the most ambitious, the most ruthless of them all, the ultimate prize was within reach, the office of the Grand Vizier, the Prime Minister, the second most powerful man in the entire world, holding the imperial seal and speaking with the Sultan's own authority. So that's the journey. From a terrified boy named Marco in a forgotten village to a powerful state official or an elite soldier named Murad at the center of a global empire. A journey of total calculated transformation. But this incredible story, this bizarre path from chains to power, raises the most difficult questions of all. Was this truly a meritocracy? Was it really an opportunity? Or was it just a more sophisticated, more insidious form of slavery that offered the illusion of power? How do we even begin to untangle that moral knot? To do that, we have to stop telling the story, and it's time to start the investigation. And that's next. So in the last part, we followed the incredible journey of our hypothetical boy Marco as he was systematically deconstructed and then rebuilt into Murad, a servant of the Ottoman state. We saw his path diverge, leading either to the elite barracks of the Janissaries or the gilded halls of the palace administration. A journey from chains to the very doorstep of power. But this incredible story, this bizarre path from prisoner to prime minister, raises the most difficult and most important questions of all. How should we understand this system? Was it simply a brutal form of slavery, or was it a twisted but real form of opportunity? How do we even begin to untangle that moral knot? Well, that is what we do here. It's time to stop telling the story and start the investigation. Welcome to the chamber. Our first task isn't just to analyze history, but to clear away the toxic fog of modern misinformation that surrounds it. You've almost certainly seen the narratives online, the ones I hinted at in the beginning. The shocking thumbnails, the angry comment sections, the documents and videos that present this system as a simple one-dimensional machine of evil, or a genocide. They throw around horrifying numbers, use inflammatory modern language, and they conveniently leave out every single shred of context. Our job here is to dismantle that narrative, not to excuse the brutality, which was very real, but to understand the complex, deeply human reality that it deliberately conceals. We're about to dismantle the simplistic, toxic narrative you see online. If you believe history deserves more than just shock value, and if you're here for the real complex truth, then make sure you're subscribed to the channel and you've hit the bell. You won't want to miss what's coming. Now let's open the case file. Let's start by looking at this modern myth head on, what we'll call the narrative of pure evil. This is the version of the story that tells you the Devshirme was a genocidal tax, that its only purpose was the brutal oppression and cultural destruction of the Christian peoples of the Balkans. It's a very powerful story because it's so simple. It creates a clear villain, the Ottoman Empire, and a clear victim, the Christian child. It gives you a satisfying sense of moral outrage. But history, as we know here at Cursed Chambers, is rarely that clean, and it is never, ever that simple. To get to the truth, we need to look at the evidence. This brings us to exhibit the paradox of the cool. This is the first and most important piece of context that the simplistic narrative never tells you. The English word slave comes with a whole universe of assumptions, mostly shaped by the context of the plantation slavery of the Atlantic world. It implies chattel fieldwork, a total lack of rights, and a permanent inherited status at the absolute bottom of society. But the Ottoman word for the Devshirme boys' cool meant something profoundly different and much, much weirder. On the one hand, yes, a cool was the Sultan's property. The Sultan literally owned him. As we said before, he could have him executed on a whim. That is the absolute definition of a lack of freedom. But on the other hand, because you belonged exclusively to the Sultan, you were also paradoxically elevated above almost everyone else. You were a member of the Sultan's extended household, a part of his body politic. This meant you were in a very real sense more noble than the freeborn nobles. A free Turkish man was a subject of the law. A Kul, on the other hand, was a subject of the Sultan. And in an absolute monarchy, that is a huge distinction. It meant you were outside and above the normal social and legal structures. Your only master, your only judge, your only father and God on earth was the Sultan himself. This created a class of people with no identity other than servant of the state. And that lack of an independent identity is precisely what made them trustworthy enough to be given immense power. This brings us to our next point. A controversial one, but a necessary one. Exhibit B, the meritocracy of the unfree. Now let me be very clear. This is in no way a defense of the system's fundamental brutality. The act of taking a child from his family is monstrous, period. But to ignore how the system functioned internally is to misunderstand it completely. In its own twisted, terrifying way, the Devshirme created a form of meritocracy that was unparalleled in Europe at the time. Think about it. In the rest of Europe, your future was determined by your birth. If you were born a peasant, you died a peasant. If you were born a minor noble, you would likely die a minor noble. But for our boy Murad, the Kul, his birth was now irrelevant. It had been erased. The only thing that mattered now was his own individual talent. If he was strong and brave, he would rise in the Janissaries. If he was brilliant and cunning, he would rise in the administration. His success was based purely on his ability, not his bloodline. This created a bizarre situation where a poor boy from a Serbian village had a clearer path to ultimate power than the son of a rich and powerful Turkish nobleman. In the later Ottoman centuries, the highest office, the Grand Vizier, was almost exclusively held by men who came from the Devshirme system. The freeborn were considered too politically unreliable. And this isn't just theory. History is filled with examples. The legendary architect Mimar Sinan, the man who designed the glorious mosques that define the skyline of Istanbul, was a product of the Devshirme. So was Sakolu Mehmed Pasha, one of the most powerful Grand Viziers in all of Ottoman history, a man who essentially ran the empire for 3 different sultans. He started his life as a Serbian boy named Bajaga. This was a system that could take a prisoner and turn him into a prime minister. The simplistic narrative of pure oppression conveniently leaves these facts out. This leads us to our final piece of evidence, the one that completely shatters the myth of some grand, unchanging plan of evil. Exhibit C, the corruption of the system. So what happens to a system designed to create a loyal slave elite when that system becomes the most prestigious and powerful career path in the entire empire the free people wanted? By the 17th century, the Devshirme and the Janissary core had become so powerful, so prestigious, that freeborn Muslim Turkish families started doing everything they could to get their sons into the system. They would bribe officials, pull strings, anything to get their children into the very schools that were originally designed to exclude them. This completely reversed the original logic of the Devshirme. It was no longer about creating a class of loyal servants with no outside ties. It was now just another institution that the rich and powerful could gain for their own advantage. This isn't the action of an empire relentlessly bent on cultural genocide. This is the action of human beings driven by very human motivations like greed, ambition, and the desire for a better life for their children. It proves that the Devshirme was not a static machine of evil, but a human institution that changed and evolved over time, eventually becoming a victim of its own success. So we return to the central question. The cursed chamber of the Devshirme was this very paradox. The curse was real. It was the theft of a child's family, his faith, and his freedom. But that very act of erasure, that act of creating a blank slate, was what made these men the perfect imperial servants. The system's unimaginable cruelty was the secret to its incredible effectiveness. And understanding this deep, uncomfortable paradox is the key to seeing through the simplistic, toxic narratives that are pushed on us today. The world is not simple, and history is even less so. The system eventually died, but its legacy is long and complicated. And what happened when this powerful class of slaves finally decided they didn't want a master anymore? That is for our final part. The echo. So at the end of our last part, we stepped into the chamber of investigation. We took the simple black and white narrative of the Devshirme system, the one you see in angry comment sections and shocking online videos, and we held it up to the light. And as is so often the case, we found that the simple story shattered into 1,000 complex, morally gray pieces. We saw how a system of profound cruelty could also function as a bizarre ladder to power. Now we step out of the chamber and into the echo to ask the final questions. How did this incredible centuries-long social experiment all end? And what does it all mean for us trying to make sense of the past today? Let's start by rendering our final verdict on the central question. Was the Devshirme system slavery or opportunity? The brutal truth, the one that simplistic narratives absolutely hate, is that it was both. It was a uniquely Ottoman solution to a uniquely Ottoman problem of empire. It was a devil's bargain offered at the tip of a sword. It was an institution built on the stolen childhoods of hundreds of thousands of boys. And it was also the very machine that produced some of the most powerful men in the known world. To say it was just one or the other is to flatten history, to turn a complex, messy human story into a cheap cartoon for modern political point scoring. The reality was a paradox. And like so many things in history, this paradoxical system carried the seeds of its own destruction within it. This brings us to the ripple effect, the great bloody final chapter of the Devshirme story. The Sultans had created the Janissaries to be a force of perfect, unshakable loyalty, a weapon that belonged only to them. But there is a fundamental problem with forging a perfect weapon, which is that eventually it starts to think for itself. What happens when the slave class becomes the most powerful class in the state? What happens when the king's bodyguards realize they are stronger than the king? By the 17th and 18th centuries, the Janissaries were no longer just the Sultan's elite troops. They were a state within a state, a powerful political bloc with their own agenda, their own business interests, and their own vision for the empire. They were, to put it bluntly, kingmakers. If they didn't like a sultan's policies, if he tried to reform them or reduce their power, they would simply rise up, storm the palace, and depose him, or, do the thing you do with a silk cord. They overthrew multiple sultans. The The tool created to ensure the Sultan's absolute power had become the single greatest threat to it. This all came to a head in 1826. The reigning Sultan Mahmud II was a reformer. He knew that the Ottoman Empire had to modernize to survive against the rising powers of Europe. And he knew the Janissaries, this powerful, conservative, and deeply entrenched institution, would stand in the way of any meaningful change. He knew they had to go. So, unlike his predecessors, he planned ahead. He secretly built a new modern European-style army, trained with modern artillery and loyal only to him. Then he announced his reforms, and right on cue, the Janissaries rose in rebellion. They overturned their famous soup kettles in the square, the traditional signal for a revolt, and marched on the palace. But this time the Sultan was ready. This wasn't going to be another palace coup. This was going to be an extermination. The event is known in Turkish history as the Vaka-i Hayriye, or the Auspicious Incident. The Sultan's new loyal artillery corps was unleashed. They surrounded the Janissary barracks in Istanbul and relentlessly shelled them into rubble. Those who weren't killed by the cannon fire fled into the streets, only to be hunted down by the Sultan's forces. Thousands were killed. The surviving leaders were executed. The entire organization, which had dominated the empire for nearly 500 years, was officially and violently abolished. The monster the empire had created, the very tool of its power, was brutally devoured by its master. The Devshirme system and its most famous, most powerful creation was officially over. And so we come to our final human insight. The story of the Devshirme is a chilling lesson in the nature of power. It shows that empires in their relentless quest for absolute security often create the very seeds of their own destruction. The perfect servant eventually wants to become the master. And it is precisely because this story is so complex, so filled with these uncomfortable paradoxes, that it is such a ripe target for misinformation in our modern world. The toxic narratives that we've discussed, the ones that scream genocide and pure evil, they have to ignore all of this. They have to ignore the Janissaries becoming kingmakers. They have to ignore Muslim families bribing their way into the system. They have to ignore the Grand Viziers who started their lives as Christian farm boys. Why do they have to erase this complexity? Because the messy truth doesn't serve a simple agenda. A story about a paradoxical, morally gray system that created a powerful ruling class, which eventually grew corrupt and was brutally destroyed by the state it served. That story is hard. It doesn't fuel online culture wars, but a simple story of a monolithic evil empire committing genocide against its victims. That is easy. That is a weapon. The true cursed chamber we've examined today isn't just a historical system from 500 years ago. It's the modern temptation to twist the past into a simple tool for the present, sacrificing real understanding for the cheap, satisfying thrill of outrage. And fighting that temptation is why we do what we do here. So what do you think? Was the end of the Janissaries an inevitable tragedy or a necessary brutal evil to save an empire? Let us know your final verdict in the comments below. And if this deep dive gave you something to think about, please don't forget to leave a like on the video. It really helps the channel grow. Thank you for joining us in this particular cursed chamber. The past is waiting.